Hi, I'm Joyce Harper, Professor of Reproductive Science at the Institute for Women's Health at University College London. Welcome to Season 3 of my podcast, Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? This season, we'll be diving into topics that explore how to achieve good health and happiness. I'll be speaking with leading experts who will provide evidence-based advice and debunk some of the many myths around our health. Additionally, I'll be having conversations with individuals who bring unique perspectives through their lived experiences. In Season 3, we'll cover a diverse range of topics, including reproductive anatomy, inspiring female icons, chronic health conditions, factors that influence our well-being, and global women's health issues. I really hope you enjoy Season 3 of Why Didn't Anyone Tell Me This? Welcome to the final podcast of 2025, and I'm going to be speaking to Professor David Nutt about alcohol, our favourite drug, and I really hope this gives you something to think about the next time you pour that glass of wine. David is a psychiatrist and the Edmond J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology in Imperial College London and Chief Research Officer at Awaknlifesciences. He is currently the founding chair of the charity drugscience.org.uk and has been president of the European Brain Council. He has published 35 books, including many on alcohol, one called Drink, The New Science of Alcohol and Your Health, and another about drugs without the hot air, minimizing the harms of legal and illegal drugs. He's also published over 1,000 research papers that define his many landmark contributions to psychopharmacology, including GABA and noradrenaline receptor function in anxiety disorders, serotonin function in depression, endorphin and dopamine function in addiction, and the neuroscience and clinical utility of psychedelics. Welcome, David.
Good to be on your program, Joyce.
So first, can you tell me about your career and what made you interested in studying alcohol and psychedelics?
Well, I suppose it really started my first day at university. I went to Cambridge. There were 9 medical students at Downing. We gathered together as medical students do. That's a sort of like poles attract. What do? Went out to the pub. In those days, the pubs closed at 10:30, which was coincident with the gates of the college closing, so we had to rush back, got into the college, and then someone had a couple of bottles of wine. So we sat down, and some of them, not me, carried on drinking. And after about 2 hours, one of them broke into wailing, crying, to a point where I thought, we better take him to hospital. I think he's going to kill himself. He sounded suicidal. And one of the other students said, oh, he's always like that when he's drunk, which struck me as a bit odd because he was only 18. He shouldn't really hardly have started drinking. But also the transition from being a sort of successful academic student, getting his A-levels, getting into Cambridge, and then turning into this completely different person as rock. I mean, wow, that's really interesting. And because I went to university to study the brain, and I decided to become a doctor to study the brain in illness as well as health. And from then on, as most doctors do, most days, most doctors see someone who's got some problems from alcohol. And that's, whether it's an orthopedic problem or an endocrine problem or, in my case, a psychiatric problem.
Yeah, we're all exposed to people like that all the time. So we'll dig into this a little bit more during the podcast, which I'm really looking forward to. And let's start with the basics. What actually is alcohol?
Well, alcohol is a very small molecule that is made from the breakdown of sugars in fruits, but which has profound effects on pretty much every cell in your body. Partly because itself is bioactive in many different ways we can talk about in a minute. It's also quite toxic, which is why you rub it on scratches on the skin to kill bugs. If it can kill a bug, bugs have got pretty tough exterior cell membranes, it certainly can do the same to any most of the cells in the body. And it's metabolized to something called acetaldehyde, which is also even more powerful chelating agent for proteins. So it's basically a psychoactive toxin. That would be the way to describe it.
And what's it doing to our brain and our body when we drink it?
So, well, we can work our way through. Let's start. You drink it. What happens is it makes a tingling taste in your mouth, particularly if it's a spirit, which most people find very aversive. In fact, studying alcohols in animals is quite challenging because they don't want to drink it. You have to give them alcohol that's laced with saccharin or sugar in order to get it in. So, so that's actually rather reminiscent of the Arco-Pops that the industry developed 20 years ago to get kids to drink. But over time, people acquire a liking for the bitterness of alcohol. And that's because eventually the alcohol gets into your brain and you get an enjoyable effect. So people associate the taste with the enjoyment. But before the alcohol gets into the brain, it goes down from your mouth. It burns your mouth, burns your pharynx, burns your esophagus, burns your stomach, gets absorbed through your stomach, goes to your liver, kills some liver cells, because the liver is really doing its desperate best to break it down because it knows you don't want it in your brain. But obviously most of it gets through the liver and gets into your brain. And there it does a sequential series of things depending on the dose and the concentration. So the first thing alcohol does in the brain is actually what most of us drink it for, which is it relaxes you. And it does that by stimulating a receptor in the brain or accentuating the effects of a receptor in the brain called GABA. GABA is the main calming neurotransmitter in the brain, and alcohol relaxes you because it makes GABA more efficient. And if we all stop there, and that's what we aim to do with our new products in our new company, with the alcohol alternatives, GABA Labs, you stop there, everything will be fine. But most people don't stop there, or not. That's not fair. A lot of people don't stop there. Too many people don't stop there. And then they push the dose up. If you push the dose up, then you begin to do something to the dopamine system. You begin to release dopamine. So that's what cocaine does. So alcohol is one of the few psychoactive substances that actually do release cocaine. One of the few psychoactive substances that do release dopamine in the brain. And that's when people start to get loud and activated and start to become very confident in their own opinions and rather dismissive of others. So that's when the sort of high of alcohol kicks in. About the same time, it starts to release endorphins, the brain's natural painkillers, which, of course, is one of the reasons why alcohol was used for almost all of the history of medicine. Alcohol was used as the analgesic anesthetic until we got proper analgesics and anesthetics 100 years ago or so. And then if you keep pushing the dose up more, you end up doing something really rather profound, which is you block the main on switch of the brain called glutamate. Alcohol blocks glutamate receptors. Glutamate receptors keep you alert, alive. They lay down memories. So the first thing you notice when you block glutamate receptors is you stop remembering things. You have a blackout. You become amnesic. And then if you keep on blocking glutamate receptors, then your brain stops working, so you die. And about 3 young people in Britain a week die of alcohol, just alcohol poisoning.
Yeah, the numbers of number of people that die and the adverse health effects are really huge, which we'll get into a little bit more in a moment. So in society, we have totally normalised drinking alcohol. If you look at any film, any TV drama, people come home and they grab their glass of wine, and it's so normalised now. Something that most people, well, not most people, some people do every day. I know many of my friends say, "Oh yes, I drink alcohol every day." It's just totally normalised. So how have we got to that situation where people are drinking alcohol and then drinking it to excess? So there are, especially at the weekends, there's people getting drunk and all the things that can happen from that. So why are we doing that?
Yeah, that's a really complex question. So the first thing to say is that you're absolutely right that the alcohol industry has become extremely sophisticated in portraying alcohol, particularly wine, as a necessary component of any kind of relaxation, particularly in relation to meals. So when I was a child, we had wine at Christmas. Now there are people who say, "Well, if you're not drinking wine with a meal, are you poor?" and Are you really? Can you? It's like that bad? I'll bring my own. Uh, and it was really brought home to me a couple of years ago when I was watching I think it was HBO series called Big Little Lies. So I don't know if you've seen it, but it's set on the on the California coast, it's the West Coast. It's full of rich, attractive women living in extremely expensive houses, having pretty shitty lives, but they have what people aspire to. And what I noticed when I started watching that there was a disclaimer at the beginning, and it says contains alcohol or scenes of alcohol. I thought that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, why would they do that? And the reason they did that was because every time the protagonists, the women, got together at lunch or in the evenings, they were always drinking wine. And they weren't just drinking small glasses of wine, 125 ml glasses that we used to be served as the standard small glass in a social occasion. They were drinking schooners. They were drinking glasses which probably had between 200 and 250 mils of wine. That's a third of a bottle. And that was what they did. And so anyone watching that program thinking, wow, I would like to be like them, would naturally subconsciously assume that you, to be like them, you would have to be drinking that much wine. And that product placement is so powerful in seducing people into becoming particularly wine drinkers. And it's one of the great transformations, sad but true transformations of essentially, social drinking in Britain. Wine was almost not hardly ever used except very, very rich people back in the 50s and 60s. Now it's the norm. Basically, a lot of people drink wine even before they go out socializing because it's a relatively cheap way of and relatively pleasant way of getting drunk.
Yeah, I've got a couple of sons at uni, and the whole thing about the prees, so them drinking in their flat before they go out, is it's a really big thing. It is just normalised, and
There was a remarkable sorry, there was a
yeah,
remarkable study done by some researchers at Lancashire University who looked at this question of free drinking in women, and they found that a trio of women would get ready to go out clubbing, and they get together and they would each bring a bottle of wine, and they would drink those bottles of wine before they went out, to the point where there was a wonderful anecdote, sad but true, that one of them was so drunk she couldn't even get out of the taxi to go clubbing. She had to take her home in the day. And it's, well, the reason, of course, people pre-drink is because it's much cheaper to buy booze in supermarkets than to buy it in licensed premises. And that is the other great social change, which was largely introduced by John Major back in the 90s, making alcohol so much more available and effectively keeping the price down. So consumption effectively doubled as a result of that availability.
yeah. And I wanted to dig more into what you said about when we were children. I definitely drank wine. I remember at Christmas, and this podcast is coming out just before Christmas because I really want people to think about what they're drinking at Christmas, but also going into next year. But for me, my mother used to give us VP wine and lemonade. I don't even know what VP wine is.
Oh, I do remember VP wine. It was disgusting. You had to dilute it with
Disgusting.
sweet lemonade.
It was disgusting. But for me, what happened with me and alcohol, and this is, and I did have family members that definitely had an alcohol problem, I think, which put me off. But for me, I was very aware, and this happened with the VP wine at Christmas as well. I just fall asleep. So why does alcohol affect different people in different ways? So you've gone through what it does to our body, but does
Yeah.
everyone have a different response to an individual response to alcohol?
Well, there are two main responses. There's you and me. We relax and we fall asleep. And there are others who, for reasons we don't fully understand, become much more animated and aggressive. There's violence. Obviously, some of those people actually seek out alcohol in order to induce that state. And that's the famous, the Scottish fighters who drink buckfast wine before they go out to get into a fight because it's a mixture of alcohol and caffeine. The caffeine offsets the sedative effects of alcohol and also potentially makes them a bit more able to fight. But the alcohol disinhibits them and also deadens the pain. So the fighting is certainly, during the fighting, they suffer a lot less. Obviously, the next day they suffer a lot. So yeah, individuals vary enormously, and we have very little understanding of what that is. It's probably genetic. We do know there are some genetic tendencies, particularly an inherited tendency to tolerance to alcohol, which runs in families of alcoholics, so they can drink more without being really impaired, and that means that they get damaged by alcohol because they do drink more because they can drink more. And there are some people who obviously are very impulsive, and alcohol there are some people who are very impulsive, and alcohol accentuates impulsivity in those. And also there are many people. In fact, the largest group of alcoholics are people who drink to deaden misery and pain, and they drink to sedate themselves and to blot out the stress of their day or the trauma of their childhood, etc. So people drink for different reasons, but the different effects are, in terms of predicting the brain effects, they're very, very poorly understood.
So all my friends listening, I'm not boring. It's just my body. It's my genetics.
Yes. I think the answer there is to film them. On your phone, and then show it to them the next day and say, well, to be honest, you probably were much more. You were pretty boring, and here's the proof. And actually, that's an interest. One of the reasons I say that is we are seeing quite a powerful shift, particularly in young people under sort of 30, 35, away from alcohol. They often call themselves low or no's, so they're either drinking nothing or they're just drinking smaller amounts, often just at weekends. And the reasons for that are complex, and I don't think even that group really understand it. But in part, it's because being very drunk and having what you do when you're very drunk immortalized on a mobile phone is very embarrassing, and actually can be totally destructive to your career. So if you do something really silly and you get it filmed, you can never eliminate that from the web. So I think people are thinking, I've got to be a bit more cautious about life now, because I am vulnerable. So, which is a good thing, for that proportion of the population, alcohol's going down. But net alcohol sales aren't changing as much as you might imagine because others are drinking more. So you've got a sort of polarization, maybe a third really cutting down and 2/3 drinking as much or more than before. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today was because I know you're a specialist in women's health, but at some point in the next year or so, the government must release the latest data on alcohol and health. And I'm almost certain when that comes out, it will show that alcohol will be the leading cause of death in women under 50. It is the leading cause of death in men under 50 in this country. Almost certain it'll be true for women when they produce the data. I think they're trying to resist producing it, but I think hopefully at some point they will have to. And that's because women under the age of 50 are drinking more than men. And that's paradoxically because women are more successful at that age. That women are more successful. They're earning more than men. They're obviously doing better at university and school. And they've taken on this sort of mantle of where if it's good enough for men and I'm better than men, I can drink like men. And sadly, they're suffering the effects of alcohol just like the men are.
But I do think a lot of it is the way that we're in society marketing, even if it's through a film or a drama on TV, or as you say, this image that success and having wealth is drinking a really nice bottle of wine from a really lovely glass. And it has for women, particularly women, really become normalised. And I think we are going to get lots of people saying, oh, Joyce, you're going to take away our enjoyment again with another podcast telling us we shouldn't be doing something that we love. But what would you say to women that to think about why have they got to do something that's so unhealthy as enjoyment? And for me, that is how we're bombarded in society with these images that this is enjoyment. Drinking alcohol every day, half of a bottle of wine, is enjoyment.
Well, it's education. This is why I'm on your podcast.
Good.
People have to understand that they have been brainwashed into thinking that alcohol is a necessary part of socialization. And And I don't know if you've read my book, but I've written this book called Drink Question Mark, and in it there's a chapter which encourages people to think about their drinking, and that's the key. Here's one message I would put to all your listeners: never drink a drink that, in hindsight, you couldn't say gave you a clear benefit. So obviously, the first drink when you start to relax socially, that is a clear benefit. The second drink, there's probably a marginal benefit. For most people, in fact, probably for everyone, beyond that, even if you think you're getting benefits because you're getting cleverer or you're getting more animated and you're dancing better, the reality is after the second drink, you're not getting benefits. And actually, so I think the current guidelines of 14 units a week for men and women are actually pretty sensible now. If you stick within those, with one proviso, don't drink them all at once, spread it out over several days. But with that proviso, very few people are going to die of an alcohol-related harm. The only exceptions actually being women who carry the BRCA gene, where alcohol is probably the only thing they can do apart from surgery to prevent the risk of breast cancer. But for most people, the government limits are actually, they would almost certainly protect you from most alcohol-related problems if you stuck with those.
I wanted to look at the short-term effects a little bit more before we go on to the long-term effects. So, particularly for women, what we hear is, yes, it's relaxing. Like you said, it does relax them. And women in the perimenopause, and they've got the hot flushes and everything, they say, they're going to say, oh, it relaxes us, and we really like this. But then that does have an effect on their sleep, on their mood. You talked about people getting angry and the effects that they have. So then the perimenopause will make you angry anyway. That all makes it worse. So tell us a little bit more about those effects on women particularly.
Well, there's almost no work done on alcohol in the menopause. Well, I suppose that's probably because there's not much work done on the menopause at all. But in terms of the pharmacology, but we do know there are changes. We do know that neurosteroids obviously change through the menopause. And we do also, and maybe you don't know, maybe most people don't know, that one of the main, maybe the main target of neurosteroids outside of the endocrine system, the ovaries and etc., is the GABA receptor in the brain. So some neurosteroids, particularly pregnenolone metabolites, are quite powerful agonists. Partial agonists. They facilitate the activity of GABA in the brain, and if those fall, the levels of those fall, then you go into a state of relative GABA deficiency, and that is associated with being anxious, being irritable, maybe even being a bit more depressed and having poor sleep. So the tendency to remedy that with alcohol, because you can't take, it's not easy to take progesterone or pregnenolone, is very simple. Alcohol delivers what you're missing in terms of the stimulation of the GABA system. But of course, the consequences of that are not ideal, because then you end up with the secondary problems of alcohol. But just to sort of close the neurosteroids discussion a little bit, because also we know that changes in the level of neurosteroids, they're profound. In fact, it's quite amazing as a man to understand how women survive these enormous fluctuations of steroids, which occur during the menstrual cycle, and particularly in pregnancy, when you get 1,000-fold elevations in these neurosteroids. And yet, women largely cope with it, despite the fact it's really messing up with their brains. But menstrual problems like catamenial epilepsy and irritability, etc., to some extent are going to be mediated through changes in the GABA system caused by changes in neurosteroids.
So drinking that glass of wine, you may think you're relaxing, but you're making these problems worse, would you say?
You are relaxing. No, there's no question. The reason alcohol exists in our society and has done, probably after psychedelics, it's probably the most enduring of all psychiatric substances. The reason it exists is because it actually is pretty reliably relaxing or pro-social. It increases sociability, conviviality. That's why it exists in most cultures, or why it's been celebrated in most cultures, and why we allow it to have this special place in a society where we'd ban other drugs, but we don't ban alcohol because so many people get some benefit. So again, if you're going through the menopause and you're going to drink a glass, well, should we define what a glass is?
Yeah.
A glass of wine is 125 mils. A lot of people don't know this. I didn't know this until I started writing my book. By law, any place that sells alcohol must serve wine in a 125 ml glass if asked. That's called a small glass. You go into any bar or any wine shop, and they will say to you, do you want a medium or large? Most people don't know that you can get a small. And of course, as I've already said, not to buy a large is to prove that you're poor and you're not trendy like the people on the TV. So the tendency is for people to drink large glasses of wine, which can be up to a third of a bottle, and that is way more than is good for you. So the key is for people to know that a small glass of wine, you can buy a small glass of wine. It is actually cheaper than a middle or a large glass. They must sell it to you, and that's probably enough to get you socializing with your friends.
But what about if you're taking, as you said, two of those 125 mils or three of those? What effects is that having on a woman at any stage of her life, both short term, and I was also thinking of sleep as well?
Yes. So what happens with your brain is a very sophisticated machine, and everything you do pharmacologically to change it, whether it's with caffeine or tea, or whether it's with drugs like alcohol, it wants to stay in control. So yes, so your brain kind of enjoys the relaxation, or your mind enjoys the relaxation, but your brain is saying, hang on, something's changed. This process of homeostasis tries to put the brain back to where it was. And a single glass of wine, single 125 mils of wine, will not induce very much adaptation. It's actually quite hard to show near adaptation to that in a scientific sense. Probably some does occur, but because even some people, even with that one unit of alcohol, that small glass of wine, will get a degree of sleep disruption after. But for most people, they won't. But if you go to 2 or the 3, when you get to 3, you are perturbing the dopamine system, the endorphin system. You're also beginning to turn off the glutamate system. And the adaptation in those transmitters, they lead to serious sleep problems. But alcohol and sleep is quite complicated. So the first thing you do is alcohol actually promotes initially deep sleep. So people like you and me who get sleepy on alcohol, when we sleep, we go into very deep sleep. And at one level, that's good. But there are 2 downsides to that. The first is if you have a tendency to sleepwalk, that's where you sleepwalk. So alcohol promotes sleepwalking and other forms of sleep disturbances like night terrors. And the second thing is that when you come out of that deep sleep, your level of sleep is less deep. So you tend to wake up early. In fact, I'll just share this anecdote with you. I've changed my drinking habits quite a lot over the last 10 years. Partly because we now have alternatives. So we have, as I'll speak about later, we've invented these alcohol alternative drinks called Sentia, and we now have ones like whiskey and beer. And I tend to drink those in the week because I don't want to have sleep disruption. But I still have quite a large wine cellar, which I'm trying to slowly get through without harming myself. At weekends, I treat myself, open a bottle of wine, and I share it with my wife over the weekend. And she does drink less than me, so I probably get close to my 14 units over the course of a weekend. And there's no question that if I have a couple of units, maybe 3 units of wine of a night, say a Saturday night, I will wake up earlier. It's absolutely predictable. I will wake up at least half an hour earlier than if I didn't. And that is the beginnings. It's not a hangover, but it's the beginning. It shows a neuroadaptation, which eventually, if I drank more, would lead to a hangover. So yeah, alcohol it disrupts sleep in a way which is not is basically should be avoided if you can.
I had totally figured out everything you'd said on my own body. I can remember I go to a lot of conferences, and I can remember going to the first conferences after I'd had children, and I saw this lovely hotel room with this lovely cozy bed with no children, and I'd always have terrible sleep. I'd wake up really
Yes.
early all the time. And I got so frustrated. And then this was about 20 years ago, I was figuring out what's going on. Then I realized I think it's a combination of the food and the wine at the dinner, but definitely the
Yes.
alcohol was disrupting my sleep. But help, as you said, that deep sleep and then this disruption. But I wanted to ask as well for young women who are listening that I've heard that alcohol is the number one date rape drug, as you said, about loss of memory.
Totally. Totally.
Is that
Totally.
true?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, every 5 or 6 years, there's a kind of cyclical hysteria about date rape drugs. And I was, once upon a time, I was in favor with the government, and I was the sort of chief scientist on the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. And there was a big concern of flunitrazepam being used to spike drinks. So we thought, well, obviously, this is potentially really worrying. So we conducted a survey of what police had discovered and what, in terms of the claims and analysis. And it turns out that more than half of cases of date rape has been reported. It's only alcohol that is involved. I mean, there are other cases when some drugs are involved, but even the other drugs are usually associated with alcohol. In fact, it's almost unheard of for someone to have a date rape on just a drug alone. And the reasons for that are twofold. The first is that alcohol is a drug, and if you drink a bottle of wine, most women who are not heavy drinkers, they will start to lose their memory. It will start to block the glutamate receptors, which allow you to remember what you're doing. So that, as well as losing your memory, you also catastrophically already have lost judgment. So you will put yourself into positions of vulnerability. You won't be sensitive to the threats of others. I mean, I'll give you an anecdote from the daughter of a friend of ours who was a student. And I spoke to him a few years ago and I said, how's she getting on? She said, oh, well, she had a terrifying experience because she got so drunk. She got in a taxi and she went home. Sensible, get in a taxi, go home. And she woke up and she didn't know where she was. And when she got out the bedroom, this wasn't her bedroom, and she got out the bedroom and there was a bloke in the flat. And she said, who are you? He said, well, I live here. And she said, no, I live here. No, he said, well, I don't think you do, because this is my flat. But you turned up at 1 o'clock in the morning. You were so drunk, you did not know where you lived, that I just put you in my room, closed the door, so you sobered up. I mean, that level of threat and vulnerability. I mean, she was really lucky. The guy was, honourable and decent, and the truth is that's not uncommon. That people don't know, just literally don't know where, can't remember, or think they live. So that vulnerability, that's the first thing to say. And then, of course, you're vulnerable. People will steal from you if they know, and they'll also assault you in other ways. You'll fall over and get hurt, and you'll bang your head. I mean, one of the things we've gradually come to understand about alcohol, in all the work we've been doing brain scans on people with alcohol problems for pushing 30 years now. The only drug that reliably damages the brain when used to excess is alcohol. And that's partly because it produces toxicity in the brain, but also quite a lot of it is due to the fact that people get head injuries because they're falling over all the time when they're drunk. So young people, don't really get drunk. I mean, if every young woman said, I will never drink more than 2 glasses of 125 mils or 1 schooner, if that was it, if everyone just said that, there would be a massive reduction in harm and a lot less damage in other ways as well.
Yeah, I've said to my kids, if you can't remember some of the evening, what was the point?
Yes,
I
and there
I
are,
don't know why
of
that's
course, there was
fun.
this horrible, yeah, but there was this horrible trend of a few years ago, which really chilled me. It was about 15 years ago or so. There was this sort of cult of what they used to say, we're going to go and get ended, which was that people would seek out amnesia as a goal. It was kind of a sort of badge of honor. Oh yeah, I drank so much I didn't remember. And in fact, frankly, through history, usually men have celebrated inebriation to a point, where they don't know, and they found that funny. But here that's actually might be quite. This is an interesting anecdote. About 10 years ago, there was a huge European program called Alice Wrap, and we were looking at drug taking across Europe, and one of the main themes was young people and alcohol. So we did surveys. We did surveys in about 5 European countries, and it was fascinating, the difference. So when you go to Italy and ask young Italians why they drink, they say, "Well, we drink because it's what you do when you have meals and when you socialize." And almost no Italian would ever admit to being drunk, because that's a sign of weakness. It's a sign of stupidity. You go to Latvia and you ask them, you say, "Why do you drink?" And they say, "Oh, we drink to get drunk." You say, well, "Isn't that dangerous?" Yeah, but that's the point. The point for us, alcohol is about being so drunk that we don't care about anything anymore. And if I guess that's kind of why quite a lot of people do end up alcohol dependent, because it does eventually, it blots everything out, doesn't it?
I have heard lots of young people say, we don't understand the point of drinking unless you're getting drunk. And I've tried to
Yeah,
argue with
yeah,
them that that's not the point of
yeah.
drinking. And drinking in moderation is much more fun when you actually remember the evening and you don't vomit.
Yeah, I
I think that's
totally
it.
agree with you. And I would definitely highly recommend that. But I will say one thing. One of the reasons alcohol persists in society is that it causes you to vomit. If it didn't, we would have so many more deaths from alcohol that we would probably have to have done something about it. But I have this theory that alcohol, because it causes you to vomit, gets rid of sufficient alcohol so that people don't die. I mean, I can't prove the theory, but it's kind of tenable, isn't it? I mean, and there were cultures. I don't know. I remember seeing this program about the German military when the Prussians were taking over Germany and were building up these huge military academies. Getting drunk was part of it was part of the ritual, but they had special devices. They had urinals at the level of the penis, and they had vomitals at the level of the mouth, and they had th- things people could hold on to, and so they could vomit without getting on their knees and getting their uniforms covered in urine. So and of course the Romans. I mean, the Romans used to drink, and then put a feather down their throat, throw up, and go back in the vomitorium. I mean, so. But that was different, because I think that the Romans were doing it to kind of perpetuate the benefit of alcohol, because they knew that if they got so drunk they would fall asleep and wouldn't enjoy the next.
I haven't vomited for about 40 years, so you can see that I definitely don't get to that stage. I wanted to explore men a little bit more. So, on a
Mhm.
Friday or Saturday night in a lot of city centres, there are a lot of police and there's lots of problems. And you mentioned about harming ourselves when we're drinking alcohol. I do have one of my sons who's ended up in A&E a few times and said, "What's happened? Can't remember, don't remember." So, what happens with men and that increase in wanting to have a fight and antisocial behavior and alcohol?
Yes, well, I think we can all probably agree that men are more aggressive than women. Uh, I've had some quite interesting um, debates. I was been actually attacked quite a few times by women who said that we should never use alcohol as an excuse for violence. And I do. It's the men that are the problem, not the alcohol. And I don't completely. I mean, I sympathise with that view, but I sympathise with that view because there is a tendency for when women to get drunk and get assaulted, that It used to be quite common that the defence was, well, she was drunk, and you don't believe what she said, and she wanted it anyway. And we now know, thankfully, the courts have moved on, so that actually it is an offence to have sex or any kind of relationship with someone who's drunk and can't give consent. So that is good progress. But with men, I think most men are definitely more aggressive than women because they just get more testosterone. And if you just got to watch any David Attenborough program to understand, it's the male. From almost every species, it's the male that is the most aggressive, the most dangerous, and the most problematic. And largely the men get sent off to kill each other. But in our society, at present, they don't. So what do? They fight each other when they're drunk. And the analogy I like to use is that, alcohol to violence is like petrol to a fire. Petrol doesn't start a fire. But if a fire starts and there's a lot of petrol there, you get a much bigger fire. So it disinhibits. And I think there are two aspects to it. I think there are some men who enjoy violence. Violence is, they enjoy watching violent films. A lot of people like joining the army. They kind of like the idea of surviving or killing other people. And obviously the traditions of sort of fighting around football matches. And so there's sort of people who, for violence is fun, and alcohol allows them to overcome what they know to be wrong. They know it shouldn't. And then there are others, and we've probably all seen these. There are others who actually are totally delightful individuals, and there's no sense of violence at all. But when they're drunk, things change. So there's obviously some deep inner predisposition to violence, which is liberated by alcohol. In the same way as there are some people who are just innerly very sad, and alcohol brings out the sadness. So I think it's alcohol violence is complicated, and the best way of reducing it is to reduce how much people drink. It's probably the only way of reducing it.
And we haven't really talked about hangovers yet. So I just want to say a little bit more about women. So I've just interviewed a lot of women for a book I've just finished. I've interviewed 51 women, and I asked them about alcohol. I did I've told you before, but I don't think the public now. I actually did my PhD on alcohol, and I got little cells drunk. So it's always, the whole effects of alcohol has always been very interesting to me. But of the women I interviewed, a lot of them said that around the perimenopause, they became totally intolerant to alcohol, both actually
Absolutely.
drinking it. So some of them felt that even drinking one glass made them immediately feel ill. But definitely a lot that said the hangover was just so pronounced that they felt it really wasn't worth it. So a lot of women seem to be, certainly post-menopause now, have either given up or really, really reduced the amount of alcohol they're taking. So what's your thoughts about that?
I think it relates to two things. I think it relates largely to the neurosteroid changes. They're losing the steroids which are protecting from the hangover. So your brain is deficient in that GABA system because you've lost the potentiating effect of neurosteroids. And also there's quite profound alterations in the noradrenaline system during the menopause. And the receptors which regulate the release of noradrenaline become down. Somehow they become less effective. They reduce in number. So it's much harder to restrain surges of noradrenaline in the sympathetic nervous system, which leads to the features of waking up early, being very anxious with a hangover. And actually, because one of the pleasing discoveries we've made with our new alcohol alternatives is that women seem to prefer them to men. I think that's largely because women don't drink as much as men, so they get more of an effect. A lot of men have got to desensitize their brains because they drink too much. But also, I think we've had menopausal women say it really did help with menopausal symptoms, because what our drinks do is they put back a little bit of the GABA effects in the brain, which you lose during the menopause.
Right, interesting. We'll come back to the drink in a minute. We're going to leave that till near the end. I just want to talk about more effects on our health. So whenever I've talked about health and chronic health conditions, I've just done a series on chronic health conditions, and as far as I'm aware, all chronic health conditions, the experts will tell us that one of the top things we need to do to lower our risk is to reduce alcohol consumption. So we can talk about cancer and heart disease and mental health problems and dementia and so much more. So what's alcohol doing in the long term?
So let me answer it in a slightly different way. If alcohol was discovered today, and your mother decided to put it into a trifle at Christmas to add flavour and interest, and it was put through food safety testing, which it has been done recently, recommended maximal amount of alcohol per year is a large glass of wine per year.
Per year.
So it's per year. So basically, it's a toxin, and if any other toxin that met that criteria would not be allowed as a food. So we basically just ignore the harms of alcohol because people like to drink, and fair enough. Those benefits are not trivial. The social benefits of alcohol. I would stay still. More than half of all people who are in relationships start their relationships in a place where they're drinking some alcohol as well, because it just breaks down the social anxiety. It breaks down the self embarrassment. It just allows people to become much more what they really want to be when they drink. But alcohol is toxic. It's toxic at the chemical level in the brain, and so the glutamate changes damage the brain. But in periphery, the toxicity largely comes from the production of free radicals, both alcohol and acetaldehyde, and that damages proteins. You get cardiomyopathy. It damages the liver. You get cirrhosis. Definitely damages the endothelium of the blood vessels, so you lay down more atheroma. But you also get the stiffening of the blood vessels, so you get hypertension. In fact, alcohol probably is the only remediable treatment for for hypertension. If you don't want to go on medication, the first thing that I say to people who are hypertensive, that if you're drinking more than the recommended government limits, cut down to that. And it's been shown that reducing alcohol consumption to that level significantly reduces blood pressure in people who are hypertensive.
Yeah. So one of the questions I was going to ask you is there a safe limit? And you said 1 glass a year.
That's for the food safety. Now, people say, well, that food safety is just, this ridiculously conservative. But, I don't know whether that food safety limit has any scientific rationale. But the point is, most other things we don't allow. Anything else that exceeded that limit, we would not allow. But getting back to what I said earlier, if you drink within the government's recommended limits and spread those 14 units out over a week, unless you are carrying the BRCA gene for cancer, you are unlikely to die from a disorder caused by the alcohol. So yes, it's toxic, but the paradox, not the paradox, the key message about alcohol toxicity is that it's not dose linear. Increasing from 0 to 14 a week marginally increases. Well, there is an small increase in risk of dying from an alcohol-related harm. If you go from 14 to 28, you increase the risk by threefold. If you go from 28 to 56, you increase the risk by eightfold. So if you're drinking a bottle of wine a day as a woman, it'll probably take 10 years off your life on average.
Wow. Okay. And another safety concern over the years has been drinking while you're pregnant. So this regulation changes all the time, and it goes lower and lower and lower. So what would you advise any woman who was pregnant with alcohol?
Well, I think if you're planning to get pregnant, then it's probably best not to drink at all. If you have accidentally, as many people have, got pregnant when you're drunk, don't worry about it. Just be sensible. If you can stop. If you I mean, obviously, the less you drink, the less risk there is to the fetus. But the reality is, again, it's not only if you heavy drinking is extremely damaging to the fetus. Absolutely. So the less you drink, the better. It's the same kind of U-shaped curve. So, but I don't think women should be made to feel guilty because they occasionally drink when they're pregnant, or they have drunk when they're pregnant. I think the anxiety about the fear of you having harmed your fetus might actually be more damaging to the fetus than the reality. So drink as little as possible. And if you're drinking more than the recommended limits, seek help to get you down, because it may be you are dependent. Ways we can help you drink less.
Yeah, I actually found when I was pregnant that alcohol tasted absolutely disgusting. I couldn't drink
You
it.
are not.
It just.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, and again, this is the paradox. Progesterone is taking over your brain. It doesn't want alcohol to compete. Get rid of that stuff. Yeah, but maybe and that's great. I mean, and a lot of women are like that. They actually find they don't want to.
There was one drink I could drink, which was champagne.
Yes, but champagne's it's important to know that champagne is different. The bubbles do facilitate the uptake of the alcohol from the stomach, so you get a quicker hit from that. Yes. Maybe that overrides the ability of your brain to say, "I don't like it." You've got the flush, and then you don't want any more. But you probably only had one glass, right?
Yeah, when I was pregnant, yeah, but it is my favourite drink.
Yeah.
Champagne, as all my friends will know, it's the one thing I want. If I'm going to have a drink, I'd rather just have a glass of champagne. Now, I wanted to explore some of the controversies. So I know that you were commissioned by the government a while ago to write a report on alcohol. And your report showed that alcohol was the most dangerous drug of all, as we've discussed. And I heard harmful. I heard that you were dismissed this was back in 2009 because the government were not aligned with the scientific evidence, particularly around the harms. Can you tell us a bit more?
I'd be delighted to tell you a bit more.
Good.
So the first thing to say is that that particular analysis was something that actually is my most cited paper. It was in the Lancet 2010. We've had over 2,500 citations. That data has been replicated subsequently in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and as yet to be published from a Canadian expert groups. So in all Western jurisdictions where alcohol is freely available, it is the most harmful drug. So what does harm mean? Well, what was particularly compelling about that Lancet paper was that we used the most sophisticated technique of assessing harms, which come in different dimensions. To get to that paper, we first set up a conference group, which spent a weekend working out what harms do drugs do. And it turned out there are 16 ways in which drugs can harm you. There are 9 harms to the user. They range from whether it kills you immediately, like heroin, or whether it destroys you through chronic use, like tobacco in the lungs, etc. And then there are 7 harms to society, to other people. And the next stage then is to score. We'd scored 20 drugs, some legal, some illegal, some medicine, some on those 16 criteria of harm. When you pull it all together and then you do a weighting of the different criteria, to my surprise, to some extent, alcohol came out on top. And that was because the social harms of alcohol are way greater than the social harms of any other drug. And that's because they are intrinsically high because of drunkenness, traffic accidents. It costs $6 billion a year to police drunkenness. It costs twice what it costs the health service to deal with the health costs of alcohol. Amazing. And then there's the opportunity cost and lost productivity through hangovers and people turning up to work. It's paid $15 or so billion. So alcohol is the most expensive costly drug to the society and the most harmful. And I would say almost every family in Britain has been harmed by alcohol, either someone in the family becoming damaged by alcohol or someone in the family being damaged by someone else who's drunk, like fights or blood transfusions. So it is it's not the most harmful drug overall. It's not the most harmful drug to the user. Drugs like heroin, fentanyl, crystal meth, crack cocaine, they're more harmful to the user, but they're used much less extensively. And what I said was, this is the reality is that alcohol is the most harmful drug, and it's more harmful than many of the drugs that the government focused on. But they were historically, they focused on drugs like psychedelics, MDMA. At the time, they were focusing on drugs like legal highs. And my view was that this is just a smokescreen to avoid what is a politically much more difficult decision to do something about alcohol. And the government didn't like that. First, they said, well, alcohol's not a drug, so you can't consider it alongside other drugs. Okay. Well,
What?
let's say that's not scientific. I'm your scientific advisor. But basically, when I said it on the Today program, they went ballistic, and they sacked me. Interestingly, subsequently, they have accepted that alcohol is a drug. They still haven't done anything about it, but they don't deny it being an important sort of verum control for assessing the harms of other drugs.
Wow, it's unbelievable. They thought it wasn't a drug to begin with. I wanted to talk about. So you looked at 20 legal and illegal drugs in your Lancet paper, and so I go raving. I go raving. Lots of people there do take drugs. Not everyone takes drugs, and I go day raving now. It's sort of older people. There's lots of people that don't take drugs. Lots of people that don't drink. They just go and have a really good time during the day and go to bed totally normal times. But if you look at raving, for example, in the 90s, so ecstasy caused people to be happy and they were loved up, and there wasn't the fights we've talked about. I don't know about the date raping thing around there. I don't know what the data is.
No,
but the government
I don't think there was
at that
any
time. No, I don't think there was any. I was there. I was clubbing, but the government and the police came down really hard on ravers, and they were saying things that taking ecstasy was going to cause dementia and so much more. And still, if you go into any single club in the UK or any festival, they will search you for drugs. What's your thoughts about that? I thought it was so interesting that the government have allowed alcohol and it's just so normalized, and then situations like raving, it's been demonized what people are doing.
Yes, so there are several things to say about that. The first is that when ecstasy was widely available, it changed the behavior at football matches.
Yeah.
There used to be an enormous violence at football matches. It was alcohol driven. And then when E was easily available, people switched to E. They had more fun, and they didn't fight the police or fight. So they actually had a massive transformation of social media because it's actually anti-violent. So that's the first thing. And actually, the police loved it. The police thought ecstasy was fantastic because they turn up to look at what was going on in a rave, and everyone would hug them. And the police would say to us, "We've never been hugged before. They usually hit us." And in fact, the Police Chiefs Association opposed the banning of ecstasy, but the government wanted to ban it. The government wanted to ban it because the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Telegraph, the right-wing press, wanted to ban it. We have no idea why they want to ban it. I think, actually, to be honest, I think newspaper proprietors just like to ban things. They like to create sort of moral hysteria. It fuels the antipathy that elderly readers of that press have to young people. And as I used to say, the editors really were very, very angry because they'd never had ecstasy in their life. And the idea that young people might be having ecstasy when these old farts didn't even know how to spell the word was very, very disturbing to them. They got it. So it was banned solely for political reasons. They created a lot of lies about the science. America, in particular, America created a whole tsunami of lies about the harms of ecstasy in order to justify a political decision. And that's what happened. Or what happened then is they changed the chief police, the head of the police lead on drugs, and he went from being the new guy became, we're going to destroy, we're going to crush anyone who's, it's going to disappear. Of course, it actually didn't. They put a few people in prison, a few kids, unfortunately, in prison. One of the interesting things we discovered, I was on a very interesting and influential review by a lady Ruth Runciman, back in the late 90s. We tried to get data from prisons on which drugs attract the longest custodial sentences. They don't. It's really difficult. They don't collect that data, or if they do, they don't make it available. But we managed to, at that time, to dig out some data, and we discovered that ecstasy possession attracted the longest average sentence of any Class A drug, up to 5 years for possession,
Wow.
not supply, possession. Because basically, if you had more than 2 tablets, you were dealing, because one was for you and one was for your mate. I mean, the hysteria about ecstasy was utterly politically driven, mostly by the Tories, to be honest, and also quite a lot of pressure from the US who were doing it as well. In the US, they did something even more outrageous, which is something we managed to get repealed a few years ago through Professor Val Curran, who's at your university. She and I advised the American Civil Liberties Union on the American penal code relating to ecstasy. In America, in order to stop ecstasy use, when they made it illegal, they said, ecstasy is both a stimulant, like cocaine, and a psychedelic, like LSD. So we are going to, an ecstasy tablet will attract equivalent penalties, the sum of the penalties for LSD and cocaine. Utterly outrageous. And Val went over there and gave evidence in a New York court where the judge was absolutely disparaging about the FDA and the way they created this completely fictitious level of harm. And she managed to get the punishments revoked from sort of 70 years in prison for 5 tablets down to about 13. But ecstasy was just a political challenge. And it's just, it's easy. Ravers tended not to vote. They were young people. It's easy not to like them. So let's appease the mass. Let's appease the conservatives by attacking a drug, and also the drinks industry supported it. The only time between 1950 and 1999, 2000, the only time there was any tendency for the annual increase in alcohol consumption to go down was when the rave scene came.
Yeah.
Drinks industry was terrified people would switch.
It is the whole society. I find it so interesting. Like, as you said, if alcohol was coming in now, it would probably be banned. And it's just how society has, and governments and police have dealt with this has just been, as you've pointed out many times over decades, it's not right, but it's now become embedded, and it hasn't, very little's changed except the legalization of cannabis in some countries. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's absolutely the sensible thing to do. I think about a third of people who drink alcohol would rather be smoking cannabis, but it's not legal in this country, just to be clear about that.
Yeah.
It's a medicine, but it's not legal. Although, thankfully, there are police chiefs who've said we're not going to bother to prosecute or to arrest people using cannabis. But yes, country, we should be. Well, actually, I'll be quite honest with you. The first thing I would say is that almost every drug law, has been developed for political, economic reasons, not for health reasons. The second thing is that the fact that the power over drugs and drug policy is vested in the Home Office, which has a policy of just saying no, and not in the Department of Health, where it is in most countries, where at least there's a chance of thinking of health as the most important element rather than use, is a big problem in this country. And what most people don't realize, a lot of people say, well, okay, you ban a drug, well, but it can't do any harm. I mean, a few people might get put in prison inappropriately, but it's not a lot of people, is it? Well, it is actually. We've doubled our prison population in the last 40 years, and that doubling is all due to drug crime. And most of that could have been avoided if we had policies like decriminalisation, as in Portugal. But even worse, on top of all that, the fact is that banning drugs that have medical value, like LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, has actually denied access to millions of patients. So it's not a victimless crime, banning a drug. It's actually a crime which actually takes away enormous medical resources. I think it's the worst censorship of medicine in the history of the world. It's 55 years of psychedelics being banned. Maybe tens of millions of people could have benefited from them, but they've been denied it simply because banning them helped get Nixon elected in the war on drugs. I mean, it's outrageous.
There's excellent research now going on about treatment for things like PTSD and mental health disorders and Parkinson, which, as you say, is decades behind because of the negative narrative around these drugs.
Well, it's not just a narrative. It's the fact that they're illegal. It's virtually impossible to. I mean, it truly is. We are one of the pioneers in this field. We just 2 years ago, almost to the day, we got permission. We got a funding from the NIHR, National Institute of Health Research, to do the world's first ever study of psilocybin, magic mushroom juice, in heroin addiction. It's taken us 2 years to get permission to start. So we spent half the grant. I mean, I laugh but we probably won't ever finish it because we have spent half of the money going through the bureaucracy to be allowed to use this drug. I mean, what an utter waste of time.
Wow.
And it's taxpayers' money.
That's really frustrating for research that really could have been of benefit to so many people.
Absolutely. I mean, it's outrageous.
But on a brighter note, let's talk about your synthetic alcohol alternative. So it's Alcarel, designed to give the pleasurable effects without the harm. Tell us more, David.
Yes. So in 2004, when I was in favour with the government, I was appointed to a government programme called the Foresight Programme. And every year the government runs, what used to, I don't know if it still does, it used to run basically a forward-looking programme that took a 25-year view of how things might change, how the landscape might change. And it did a whole sorts of interesting things. It did flood defences, it did how to help Africa. Every year they chose a topic. And in 2004 they chose the topic of brain science, drugs and addiction. And they asked me and the two other people to be the leaders of it. So I was the lead psychiatrist, and there was a neuroscientist, Trevor Robbins from Cambridge, and Jerry Stimson, who was an epidemiologist and a policymaker in addiction. And for a year, we convened a whole series of expert meetings with experts all over the world, looking at that question: how will brain science affect the use of drugs and addiction? And obviously, one of the topics was alcohol. And during the course of that year, in particular, one brainstorming session, it kind of came to me that up to that point, half my life I'd spent working on ways of reducing the harms of alcohol, stopping people craving alcohol, inventing new treatments for alcohol withdrawal, and almost getting nowhere. And then, within the Foresight program, I suddenly thought, hang on, alcohol is too promiscuous, it's too toxic, kills all the cells and harms. We can never find an antidote to alcohol. Why don't we just replace it? Oh, so that went into the book. And then I wrote a paper about it saying it's time to use science to replace alcohol. And I've been trying to do that ever since. That was 20 years ago. And actually, the concept is easy. The practice is easy. I've demonstrated sort of prototypes. The big problem is getting funding. Because you go to investors and they say, well, does it work? I say, yeah, it works. Like, I can try a prototype. I can't. We haven't put the new molecules through testing yet, but I can show you. And they say, oh, that's good. And they say, well, so is it legal? And I say, well, that prototype is, because it's already a legal drug. But they say, well, will your new drug stay legal? And I say, well, I hope so. And they say, what do you mean, hope so? And I say, well, there is this problem that the drug laws are so irrational that, the government can, at a whim, ban anything. And they say, well, thanks, I'll take my money elsewhere. So the uncertainty, the legal uncertainty about what drugs can or not be used is quite a concern. And of course, it got worse with the Psychoactive Substances Act when Theresa May, as Home Secretary, decided to ban anything that affected the brain, even if it made you cleverer, even if it made you vote Tory. So basically, the default position. I mean, this is embarrassing. The default position in this country, if it affects your brain, it should be illegal. Okay, so we haven't given up, because we are not going to be selling it as a drug that affects your brain. We're going to be selling it as a foodstuff. And in the USA, there is a process for taking new molecules through as foods. It's called generally regarded. So our molecules, which we've invented, which work, if once we get funding, we will take them through the US GRAS procedure, put them on the market in the US, and hopefully then it'll be harder for the British government to say, no, you can't sell them here. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to raise funding to do that. But it's proved very challenging because, I mean, we don't need a lot of money. We need a few £1 million or dollars, which to billionaires should be just a drop in the ocean. But I think there's still, one of the things I've discovered talking to investors is that they really like to be second. If someone's shown it works, then they'll invest in the follow-ups. They're terrified of going out on a limb, which I find really pathetic. But in the meantime, and this is a success bit of this, in the meantime, we have developed botanical alternatives. We decided to look into nature. We knew that there are herbs out there which have been approved as foods or food additives, used as medicines, Ayurvedic, Chinese medicines for centuries, that are both relaxing, pro-social, and work through GABA. So we've made these drinks cocktails which promote GABA in the brain in a similar way to alcohol. And we are selling those, and we're selling them as drinks which are freestanding drinks. They're like vermouths. But we're also we've now invented alternatives for people who have a preferred drink. So we now have a botanical whiskey and a botanical alcohol-free beer, alcohol-free lager, alcohol-free cider. So now there is an option. People have an option. If they want a functional effect, they want to relax, they can use a botanical drink, which will not harm them like alcohol, and on which you cannot get drunk. Even if you drink the whole bottle, you won't get drunk. The effects will last longer, but it's just chilled.
That's good news. Really, really good news. Now there's another another supplement I heard of recently. So it's a pre-alcohol supplement, which apparently is genetically engineered. They always make that sound so great, to break down the byproduct in alcohol responsible for giving us a hangover. So tell us what you know about that. I know that's not something you were involved with, but tell us what is that true? Is that it's going to help anyone?
People have been doing this for decades, not with genetically engineered bugs, but they've been doing it with enzyme supplements. The principle is very straightforward. You take something, a powder, which contains an enzyme that breaks down alcohol and acetaldehyde. So less of it gets into your body, so there's less effect in the body. So basically, you take it and you can drink as much as you like, or you can drink as much as you did before, but you won't poison yourself too much. But actually, the reality is you won't get as drunk, so you may as well just drink less.
That's good advice. Save your money.
It is. Well, absolutely. It is. I suppose there are people who feel that drinking less would destroy their status in a peer group, so maybe they'll take it and think, I'm still drinking, I'm not damaging myself. But I did experiments on myself when I was a medical student, because I've been interested in how to avoid the complications of alcohol. If you take a lot of fructose accelerates the metabolism of alcohol. So this has been known since the 1930s, I think. It's just most people think it's just a waste of money. It is much cheaper to drink less, to buy something else to offset the effects of alcohol.
That is brilliant. That's great advice. Well, I was talking about advice. So when I told some people I was talking to you, and someone said to me they had read a scientific paper, I don't know if this is true, that said that drinking red wine increased longevity. Myth or truth?
So the answer is this. Yeah, drinking red wine may have health benefits, but they are limited to people who drink red wine living in Provence and eating the Mediterranean diet and getting a lot of vitamin D from the sunshine. So yeah, absolutely. But red wine only to be taken when on holiday in Provence. Whether you're using it elsewhere in the world, it probably doesn't work.
Yeah, it's always this causation and effect is gets very confused by some people in different types of studies. Are there any other myths that you hear
I can
people
take
talk
you. I could
about?
take you on a bit further. Let me take that one on a bit further because it's actually been tested. Harvard University made an awful lot of money selling the active ingredient in red wine, resveratrol, to a GSK, thinking it was going to cure Alzheimer's through being anti-inflammatory, and it didn't work at all. So we're pretty confident that red wine isn't an antioxidant, but anyway, but it's probably safer to drink it in Provence if you're going to drink a lot of it. Right? Other myths? Are there any other myths? Yes. Well, that's yeah. Well, let me think. Are there any other myths of alcohol that we need to debunk? Well, there's a sort of myth that if you can drink yourself sober, which is kind of true. You can drink yourself sober. If you carry on drinking and drinking, your brain and your body will adapt and adapt and adapt. So you are less intoxicated. But all that means is you're extending the duration of the poison, and it's still and it actually could be dangerous, not just because of the poisoning, but the fact is, if you think you're sober, and you might be a bit, driving may still be impaired because you've been up all night and you're sleep deprived, and the breathalyzer will still find you positive. So it's not something I would encourage people to do. There's also the myth that people say, well, you get if I mix drinks, I get worse hangovers, and the answer is that's not true. Alcohol hangover is pretty much largely determined by the amount of alcohol, not by the type of drink. With the proviso I'm going to come to in a minute, but the problem is mixing drinks. People lose count, so it's harder for them to control what they do. The proviso about hangovers is very complex alcohols, like very aged brandies, very aged whiskies. The aging process makes more and more complicated, complex alcohols. So in beer, the main alcohol in beer is ethanol, but there are at least 40 other congeners of alcohol. The alcohol molecule sticks together in different shapes. So beer is mostly ethanol, but lots of congeners. You get a complex aged whiskey or brandy, there may be 400 different alcohols. And some of those alcohols are extremely toxic and potent. And so, yes, that's part of the reason you have a much nicer flavour and enjoyment, but they're also likely to produce more perturbations of the brain. They're so toxic, people couldn't ever test them in humans in large amounts, but those small amounts probably are creating more havoc in the brain than ethanol itself.
And just to finish off, have you got any figures? So you have given us a few figures as you've gone through, but any other figures on number of people that die? And you mentioned about probably the biggest killer in women, etc. Have we got any worrying figures to put people off?
Under 50, men and women under 50, alcohol. Yeah. So in the UK, 8,000 deaths directly attributable to alcohol, and about another 20,000 attributable to other alcohol-related issues like cancer. And that's 4 times all other drugs put together, apart from tobacco. So, yes, so there's that. And globally, 3.5 million deaths a year from alcohol. So that's more than COVID. How much do we invest in treating alcohol, preventing alcohol? Globally, virtually nothing. How much do we invest in trying to stop COVID? I don't know, $1 trillion. So, there's a kind of bizarre. We have this blind spot. We have this blinkered approach to alcohol because it's been around for a very long time. It's in the Bible. It's something we take at church. If you go to communion, symbolism of the wine as blood. So, alcohol is something that is embedded into our society, and we have chosen to ignore its harms. The alcohol industry has magnificently played down its harms and befuddled us and befuddled politicians about its dangers. And now it's time to remedy the balance. And we haven't been able to remedy it without alternatives, because humans do need something to help them socialize. We're very social creatures. We just dominated the globe by virtue of our working as huge groups, nations, teams. But we have that social anxiety when we socialize, and alcohol just liberates us. And that's why it's survived and why we need to replace it.
Yeah, those numbers are really, really extreme. So it's important to think about them. So I hope that our conversation has helped some people think about their alcohol for the next few years, or definitely coming into 2026, and think about how they're going to drink over Christmas. And David, my very last questions, just to cheer everybody up, I ask all my guests, what makes you happy and where is your happy place?
My happy place is in my garden with my dogs. And what makes me happy is walking with my dogs, but also talking to intelligent people like you, Joyce.
Thank you. And this is a bit of a fun question as well. Very last question. What have you got advice you'd give your younger self?
Yeah, go into a branch of science which was more tractable. Get out. Don't go into politics. Don't go into policy. Changing governments, very, very. Yeah. I mean, well, I don't know. Someone's got to do it, but would I have done things differently? I became a doctor to do research. I became a brain scientist because the brain's more interesting than anything else. And I guess my only failing, I've done quite a lot of good stuff, but governments aren't rational. Or humans aren't rational. As Einstein said, there's only two things that are infinite: the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not so sure about the universe. So, yeah, I mean, that is trying to get humans to change is challenging. But we may be winning. The fact that younger people are now taking a different attitude to alcohol than their parents and older people, and that's quite exciting. So, let's encourage that and facilitate it.
That's a good place to stop. Thanks very much, David. Thank you.
Lovely to talk. That was an hour and a half. Wow, I didn't realize I could talk for that long.
We can.
You've obviously you've hit a topic of interest to me. You must have worked that one out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.